to record. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Adult Education for April 25th, 2021. It is wonderful to be here and a joy to be able to be together in this virtual space. Let us pray. Holy and gracious God, we give thanks for the day that you have made and for the opportunity to learn more about your creation, about your world, about the things that we do to help each other, to love each other, and to show your love to our neighbor. We give thanks for the opportunity to learn. It is a joy and a privilege to be able to do so. Amen. All right, Polly, would you like to welcome our guest?
I will.
Thank you.
Recently, the Adult Ed program has been doing a series on compassion, giving of ourselves. And today we will continue that theme. And I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Carol Haye. She's the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Organ and Tissue Donation Program at the University of Wisconsin here in Madison. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you, Polly. And I believe it's okay if I share my PowerPoint, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. Just a minute here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to spend time with you today. And I'll tell you a little bit about my background and how I came to this work. I actually received a kidney transplant in 2011. So I recently celebrated my 10th year anniversary. And my kidney transplant was from a deceased donor. I have a genetic kidney disease for which there is no cure. And I was very, very fortunate to be able to be listed at UW Hospital for their transplant program. And I was told I would wait 2 to 3 years before I received a kidney. And in the meantime, people were agreeing to be tested to see if they could be a living donor to me, which was incredibly humbling to have people step forward with that generous gift. And unfortunately, no one matched me, but wouldn't you know, 3 months after I was listed, I received a call from UW Transplant saying, Carol, we have a perfect match for you. How soon can you get here? And I was there in 45 minutes and received my transplant. And I'm so grateful. I have been able to meet my donor family. We have a fantastic relationship. We see each other several times a year, and we communicate when we're not able to see each other. So I feel very fortunate to be able to have received that gift and also to be able to work in this field now. And so, Polly, I appreciate you asking me to come and talk to you a little bit about organ and tissue donation, and we will have time for questions after the end. So it's very opportune that Polly asked me to talk to you this month because April is National Donate Life Month. And this is a month when we put a lot of effort into communicating the importance of organ, tissue, and eye donation and the need for organ donation and tissue donation and cornea donation, and encouraging people to register on their state donor registry. And I just wanted to go over a little bit of what is the need currently? And I looked up the statistics last week, and currently there are over 107,000 people waiting in the US and over 1,600 waiting. And we just closed a week-long event where we were featuring pediatric transplant stories. And in Wisconsin, there are 50 children under the ages of 18 who need an organ transplant right now. And I wanted to show this graph. It is a little bit busy. The top line is the number of people who were waitlisted during each year for the past 10 years. And while the wait list has decreased a little bit, you can see that there is a very large gap between the top line and the blue line, which is the number of transplants performed. And the number of donors, and that includes deceased and living donors, has remained relatively flat. It did get almost to $20,000 or 20,000 people, but there is still this very large gap between the number of people who need an organ transplant and the people who are able to become donors. And this does not include the number of people who need a tissue transplant or a corneal transplant. So the reason that deceased organ donation is rare is that actually 3 out of 100 die as a result of brain death. And brain death is the state of death when someone is able to be an organ donor. And what that means is that they are in a hospital, they are on mechanical ventilation, and a grave prognosis has been delivered to the family, meaning that there is nothing more the medical team can do for that patient. Unfortunately, that patient has not survived the trauma, and brain death is the actual time of death. And this is different from circulatory death when we pass away from heart failure. Brain death occurs because there is a lack of oxygen to the brain, and that can result due to a stroke. It can be a motor vehicle accident. It can be another trauma to the head. It can even be a drug overdose. So we do have deceased donors who have passed away from a drug overdose who have gone on to become donors, and there is no issue in transplanting their organs into a recipient. So we don't have any issues with that. So brain death is death. What happens in the hospital is that a neurologist will come and do 35 different tests on that patient to ensure that they are brain dead. And sometimes that test includes having a brain scan to make sure that there is no electrical activity in either the brain stem or the brain. And there is no coming back. And unfortunately, sometimes we are working with families who are hoping for a miracle, hoping that something will change, but we are not able to change that situation. So who can be a deceased donor? We have donors that are as young as 1 month old, and we have had an organ donor that was as old as 87, and we have had a tissue donor that was 107 years old in the United States. So sometimes when I'm meeting with people or talking with people about whether or not they should register, someone will say to me, Carol, I'm 70, so I probably should just take myself off the registry list, right? And I'll say, no, actually, we hope that you will continue to register if you've already done so, because there is no age limit to be a donor. Statistics actually say you are 6 times more likely to need a transplant than to be a donor. And it's interesting to me that since I've been in this world of organ donation, I've met so many people who have had tissue transplants that don't even realize their tissue transplant came from a deceased donor. Tissue can actually be recovered and stored for up to 5 years, so that it is something that a surgeon can call on if they need bone to repair either a dental implant or back surgery. Also, cancerous tumors in limbs can be removed and replaced with bone from a donor. So those are just some examples of some tissue transplants that can take place. So the fact is that every single day, 9 people, 1 person is added to the transplant waiting list every 9 minutes. And that's by a transplant center that has approved that patient to get a transplant at their center. A person who needs a transplant can actually list at multiple transplant centers. So for example, someone who lives here in Wisconsin could actually list at the transplant center at Froedtert in Milwaukee, at St. Luke's Aurora, and also here at UW Health if they want to. And by listing at multiple centers, a recipient is actually hedging their bets a little bit. They may get a call from one center over another, and they might be able to get that needed organ transplant a little bit sooner. And the sad fact is that 17 people die each day before they receive that gift of life. The power of deceased organ donation is very powerful. One donor can donate up to 8 organs, and that includes, of course, the heart, liver. Sometimes the liver is actually split from a deceased donor and transplanted into 2 different patients. And the liver is an amazing organ in that it will regenerate to its full size in about 2 to 3 months. Lungs can also be transplanted. So sometimes a patient will receive both lungs, and sometimes one patient will receive the left lung and another patient will receive the right lung. Kidneys, I'm sure you're very aware of kidney transplant. It's in the news more often than not. And 2 kidneys can also be transplanted. They can be transplanted into separate recipients. And sometimes they are transplanted what is called en bloc. So 2 kidneys will be placed in one recipient. And that's because maybe the donor was a little bit older and that patient would function better with both the kidneys from that donor. Pancreas transplants are done especially for people who have type 1 diabetes. And these individuals can receive a pancreas transplant and they are rid of their type 1 diabetes, which is an amazing gift to someone who has been struggling keeping their insulin levels under control. And then the small intestine can also be transplanted. This is much more rare. There are only about 50 small intestine transplants that are done every year. But as you can see, one person can save 8 or even more, depending on their organs and if they're able to split the lungs between 2 different recipients and the kidneys between 2 different recipients. I already talked a little bit about the power of deceased tissue donation, but it can actually impact people up to 75 or even more. Many tissues can be recovered from a deceased donor, and they include skin. They also include, as I mentioned before, bone. They also include veins, and veins are transplanted into people who might need a fistula to start dialysis, and their veins aren't strong enough or big enough. Veins are typically taken from male donors, not women, but women can donate veins as well. Skin is also used, and that is used for mastectomy repair. It's also used for hernia repair, and it is also a life-saving transplant for a burn victim. So skin is recovered from the back of the body and it can be saved. And there are burn victims who may not have enough skin of their own that can be removed and grafted onto the burn areas. And so they can that's actually a life-saving tissue transplant. I was asked to talk a little bit about living kidney donation. And living kidney donation is a wonderful gift because actually statistics and data show that someone who receives a kidney from a living donor has a much greater chance to live longer with that transplant. We also call that a graft. And one of the reasons that this is actually a great thing for both the donor and the recipient is that it can be on the donor's timeline. I'll give you an example. My sister has the same kidney disease that I do, and she was able to receive her transplant from a living donor, and that living donor had a trip planned overseas. So she actually donated into a kidney exchange in June of 2019. My sister received a kidney from someone else in the exchange who actually was a better match for my sister in August. And so her generous donor was able to donate in June, recover, go on her overseas trip. And my sister was able to receive her kidney in August, which was much better for her work schedule so that she could have a couple of weeks off of work after her transplant. Generally, a living kidney donation will reduce the wait time for a recipient as well. And I've already mentioned it's a great kidney. It's usually a longer graft survival. And donors do not need to be a blood relative. Originally, the first kidney transplants that were successful were between twin brothers. However, actually, many times we can find a better match with someone else who is either registered in the National Kidney Registry, which is a separate registry from the waiting list that patients go on, or a hospital will have their own kind of registry and they'll work out their own pairs. Donors don't need to be the same ethnicity either. A Black can receive a kidney from someone who's white or Hispanic. So that doesn't really matter. What matters is the blood type and the tissue typing, as well as height and weight. So as long as the donor and the recipient share similar height and weight and their blood and tissue types match, then that can be an effective transplant for someone. In Wisconsin and here at the UW, we offer actually an insurance program that UW pays for people who are interested in being living donors, and it's called Donor Shield. And that actually helps defray some expenses that the donor might encounter, whether it is for travel expenses to come in for clinic visits, could be hotel, could also replace some lost wages too. So we try to remove all the barriers that we can for people who are willing to be living donors, because they are amazing individuals. And in Wisconsin, a state employee can actually deduct some money from their taxes. And also in Wisconsin, any person who has been a kidney donor gets a kind of a rebate on your taxes for the following year. So the power of living donation, it really does save 2 lives. And what I mean by that is that a living donor is helping save someone who either might not go on the national waiting list for a deceased donation, which allows someone who is on the national waiting list to be eligible for a kidney that matches them. And data has shown that generally that has helped people get a kidney sooner if they're on the national waiting list for a deceased kidney, when other people are getting a living kidney donation. What's pretty important to understand is that people who need kidneys make up 80% of the national wait list. And then 15% need a liver transplant. And then the remaining need heart, lungs, pancreas, or intestine. So the kidney and liver really make up 95% of those who need a transplant. So who can be a living donor? Well, as you can see from this picture, it can be just about anybody over 18. All we ask is that it's an adult over 18. You are given a physical that the recipient will pay for. So the donor insurance does not pay for that. You are also assessed to make sure that you're in strong emotional health and that you have a good support system. You're screened by a transplant center that does living kidney donation. You receive the best physical of your life. And then the recipient's insurance pays any costs related to being a living donor, except for lost wages. So this slide can look a little confusing, but at UW, we have 6 different ways that people can be a living donor. You can directly donate to someone that you know who is in need of a kidney, as long as your blood and tissue typing match the recipient. You can also do a non-directed donation where you might not know somebody who needs a kidney, but you can donate into the Paired Kidney Exchange or the National Kidney Registry. And that's shown in the center of the screen, labeled number 2. Paired Kidney Exchanges actually it's a different registry that was created by a father whose daughter needed a kidney transplant. And he thought there's got to be a better way when people want to be living donors. And so people who want to donate into the Paired Kidney Exchange program get assessed by a transplant center. You can be an altruistic donor and have no idea who is going to receive your kidney. You're just willing to do that. And then they match you with a recipient that's also listed in the National Kidney Registry. There is also a compatible share program where one person might be donating to another person's spouse, and then the spouse of that individual is donating to that person's spouse or brother or father, someone that's related. And so that's where 2 pairs donate to among one another, because the donors match the recipients a little bit better. And then there's a voucher program. Yesterday in Madison, we had a living donor named Mark Scotch, who just embarked on a 1,500 bicycle ride from Madison to Natchitoches, Louisiana. He is doing this because he donated in September at UW, September 2020, and his recipient, Hugh, received a kidney from someone else in a voucher program earlier this year. So Hugh wasn't able to receive a transplant until 2021, but Mark was able to donate in September of 2020. And Mark is, I call him kind of an ultra cyclist. He cycles an average of 100 miles a day. And he is riding his bike to Natchitoches, Louisiana. He expects to be there in about 23 days, and he's going to meet up with Hugh for the first time since he and Hugh got together in 2019. And Mark agreed to donate a kidney to Hugh. So that was donated into the voucher program. We kind of think of it like a coupon program. And then there's also short-term advance donation where someone donates into the program and then their intended recipient gets a kidney from someone else a few months later. So many different ways to be involved in the National Kidney Registry for living donation. And living kidney donation at UW, I wanted to give you a little insight into it. We are one of the largest kidney transplant centers in the US. We have done over 3,000 living donations since 1996. We are also the largest utilizer of the National Kidney Registry. I'm sorry to tell you that last year we did have a 34% reduction in living kidney donation at UW. We only did 87, and that was due to the pandemic because living kidney operations are not considered to be emergency surgery. So unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we had to postpone many people from 2020 into 2021, and we'll just hope that we'll be able to get those people back on track. Now, we also do living liver donation at UW, and this is done at other transplant centers as well. Deceased donor livers are allocated to the sickest waitlisted patients. So people who do need a liver but aren't very sick may never get that liver transplant because they aren't sick enough. So if they can find a living liver donor, that can be just life-saving for them. Wisconsin living liver donors also receive a tax break for that year. There aren't as many living liver donors. It's a much more challenging surgery. It's a longer recovery for the donor. But I will tell you that last year we had 2 donors in 2020 that did donate a portion of their liver. So they donate up to 60% of their liver to the recipient. One of those people was an altruistic donor who had previously donated a kidney. So here she is back again, donating a part of her liver. So we can't thank her enough for being the gracious person that she is. I did want to show you a chart of how the pandemic impacted living kidney donation. You can see that we were really at a high in 2019 with almost 7,500 living kidney donors. And last year we dropped to about 5,700, and that was due to the pandemic and people having to shut down their living donor programs while so many people were hospitalized. I was also asked to give a little bit of information about bone marrow and blood stem cells donation. And this is managed by an organization called Be the Match. So you can go to bethematch.org to get more information. However, in the last few years, they have limited the ages of people that they are willing to take as donors to ages 18 to 44. Be the Match handles bone marrow donations for citizens of the US or Puerto Rico who want to sign up, as long as you're between the ages of 18 and 44, and you do have to meet some health guidelines. If you are interested or anyone else is interested, you can go to their website. There are 4 steps. There's a registration step that takes some health information from you. If you pass the health information, they will send a swab kit to you. You return the swab kit, and then the DNA matching is done. Your information is input into their database. And then when a recipient does need a bone marrow or blood stem cell transplant, then they can pull that matching information. So that's a little bit about Be the Match. I also want to just touch on whole body donation because I do get questions about this. Whole body donation is different from registering on your driver's license or state ID to be a donor. Whole body donation must be prearranged with a medical school, and both medical schools here in Wisconsin do accept whole body donation. I do let people know that the medical school may decline the donation at the time of death if there is no need, and that does happen occasionally. We also want families to understand that the cremains of their loved one may take up to 2 years to be returned to them. And every medical school has different policies about whether or not they pay for cremation or whether the family or the estate of the individual pays for cremation. If this is something that you choose to do, you would not be able to be an organ donor because your whole body would need to go to the medical school. But people who donate their whole body can donate corneas. So an eye bank can come and recover the corneas before the body is transported to the medical school. And just like when you register to be a donor, we hope that you will inform your family. And it's also helpful if you include that information in an advance directive for healthcare. If you do opt for whole body donation, you do not need to opt out as a registered organ donor on your state donor registry if you've already gotten the orange donor dot that we have here in Wisconsin. The paperwork would be available, and your family hopefully would know your intent. And so those arrangements can be made between the hospital and the medical school. So what's interesting about the Wisconsin Donor Registry? We do have about 3 million people out of our population of 5 million registered. So we have about 58% of the population registered, but we still have 42% of the state that is not registered. And when I talk to people out in the public, they will tell me things like, oh, I'm too old, Carol, or I had cancer and my doctor told me that I can't donate. Well, to be honest, most physicians, oncologists, et cetera, don't necessarily know whether or not someone can be a donor. So we hope that people will allow the transplant community to make that decision. And I'll talk a little bit about what happens when a patient is referred to an organ procurement organization like the one that I work for at UW Organ and Tissue Donation. But we really encourage everyone to register regardless of whether you think you're an eligible donor or not, because of the rarity of becoming a deceased donor. Remember, I pointed out that's less than 3% of the population dies in a manner that allows for deceased organ donation. If you do pass away in a nursing home or a care facility, it is possible that you can be a tissue donor or a cornea donor. It becomes more complex in facilities like that, but if you do pass away in a hospital of circulatory death, arrangements can be made for tissue recovery and cornea recovery. So what is interesting about the Wisconsin donors is that women have registered at 68% of the population, that's over 15.5%, and men have registered at 57%. There is a 10% gap on average between men registering for as a donor and women. And when I have talked to men, they have said things to me like the reason they haven't registered is because their spouse, their partner, their significant other didn't tell them to do that. I've also had men tell me that they think that they had an illness that would prevent them from being a donor, or they drink a 6-pack of beer on a Saturday night, so they don't think their liver is any good. All of those reasons are not necessarily reasons to opt out on your own as a registered donor. So we do encourage people to register. What is interesting is that within our own organ procurement organization, it is men who are donors more often than women. So it is a gift to your family if you register as a donor so that they don't have to make that decision on your behalf. So anyone can register regardless of age, race, your medical history, whether or not you've had cancer. And you can also register regardless of whether you use recreational alcohol or drugs. And organ tissue and eye donation are not options until death has been declared. I do talk to people who are worried that if the emergency room doc or the ICU doc knows that they are a donor, that they won't do everything to save their life. And that is simply not true. The medical community, at the healthcare professionals at the hospital will do everything that they can to save their patients' lives. Once someone has demonstrated the symptoms of brain death, then their case is referred to an organ procurement organization that hospital works with. And when that happens, transplant professionals do monitor that patient's case. They do look at their medical history. They may recommend certain tests, but there is a distinct difference between the care team for the patient and the care team that might then take over that case once the person has been declared brain dead. So the priority for medical professionals is always to save your life, regardless of your donor registration status. Other families are concerned that they might have to pay some of the expenses for the donation. And what happens is when you're admitted to an ER or an ICU, of course, the medical team is trying to save your life. They may be performing procedures and tests, and your insurance or your family's insurance would be paying for those costs. But once it is determined that you are eligible to be a donor and that you can go on to be an organ donor, then those costs are passed along to the organ procurement organization that then passes along those expenses to the recipients' insurance companies. So there is no cost to the donor or their family for any expenses, and that is tests, recovery, transportation, etc., for organ tissue and cornea donation. The family does pay for funeral expenses. Those are not picked up by the organ procurement organization, but there is a clear, distinct window when those expenses are paid for by the recipient's insurance. And all major religions do support donation as an act of charity and generosity. The Shinto religion that is practiced mainly in Japan is not as open to organ donation, but 99.99% of the world's religions are in favor of organ donation. And something else that people ask me about is whether or not an open casket funeral is possible. And that, of course, is true. An open casket funeral is possible, and the funeral home will work with the family so that if they want a specific outfit for their loved one to be wearing in the casket, then they can make that happen. So we've had people who were, we had a person that was killed riding their Harley, and their family wanted him to be in a tank top and with all of his tattoos showing. And he was a skin donor. So the skin was removed from the back, but you weren't able to tell that because the family still was able to have an open casket funeral. This is how you can register. There's multiple ways here in Wisconsin. You can register on the Wisconsin Donor Registry, which is donorregistry.wisconsin.gov. And you can also change your address there, and you can also opt out. So if at some point after you register, you decide that you don't want to be a registered donor, you can go back and with your driver's license or state ID, you can opt out from the Wisconsin Donor Registry. If you don't get your donor dot on your license when you go to the DMV, you can register online at the donorregistry.wisconsin.gov. You can also register on your advance directive for healthcare, but because you would want to have copies distributed to your next of kin, to your primary care physician, to any hospital that you might visit, that can be a little bit more difficult and take more time to investigate. An organ procurement organization, the nurses that work for us have authorization in every state donor registry, as well as the National Donor Registry that Donate Life America started. So they can check a donor registry to see whether or not an individual is registered on their state or the National Donor Registry. I don't recommend that people in Wisconsin register on the National Donor Registry. It is a wonderful advantage for people, but in Wisconsin, when you register, that is your legal authorization for recovery of organs, tissues, and corneas for three purposes: transplantation, research, and education. The National Registry is legal authorization for transplantation only. And that reason is that every state has variations to what their donor registry legally authorizes recovery for. So they went with, I'm going to call it the lowest common denominator. What happens in Wisconsin when we work with a family and we have social workers who are sent to the hospital to work with the family through this very challenging time for them, if their loved one has registered on the National Donor Registry, they have to actually sign other paperwork and consent to recovery for research and education, just in case that might happen. And when we are not able to recover organs or tissues for transplantation, we do everything we can to find a research program that is looking for those organs or tissues, so that especially when someone is a registered donor, we're honoring their wishes. So this is my last slide, and I can open it up to questions after this. Organ and tissue donation is not a tragedy, but it can be a beautiful light in the midst of one. And I put this up here because we work with many donor families, and I am amazed at how they can come through their grief journey feeling as if their loved one's legacy was a bright light for them, despite the dark times that they have suffered through the death of their loved one. And we have one of my volunteers, her son was a donor. He was 19 years old, and a random act of violence, someone was shooting off a gun. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He ended up being shot in the head and became a donor. And she said the fact that her son had registered as a donor and was able to save lives actually saved her through a very, very dark time. She became very depressed. But once she was able to kind of work through that and understand that her son had left a legacy and was able to meet some of the recipients, that was very helpful and hopeful for her. So that's really all I have to share. So I'll stop sharing and I can open it up to any questions that you have. And I see there's something in the chat, so let me look at that. Oh, okay. Someone said, thanks for the presentation, going to get their second shot. I know what that is like. I've been vaccinated for over a month now, and it just feels fantastic.
Yeah, that's very good news. Well, thank you so much for that presentation, informative and thorough and helpful. I have it in gallery view now, so I can see any hands that may be raised for anyone who may have a question. Bob, yes, go ahead.
Didn't the University of Wisconsin recently get written up for the fact that they had the most of some sort of transplants? Was it a kidney transplants or kidney and something else?
Yes, it was actually in the news last week. It was celebrating the fact that we were the highest utilizer of the National Kidney Registry for paired kidney exchanges. And so thanks for that question, Bob. I also want to say that we were part of the largest chain. In 2018, there was a paired kidney exchange that involved 35 donors and 35 recipients. And we started the chain at UW and we ended the chain at UW. And it took about 6 months for that to take place. It involved 25 different hospitals, different transplant centers. And I'll tell you, those can be very dicey because if one donor gets sick or if one recipient is too sick to receive the kidney, it breaks the whole chain. But that is just a fantastic way to help save lives and keep people off the national waiting list so that others can maybe get that life-saving organ that they need.
Let's see here.
Yeah, Bob.
That sounds like a lot of computer work to make that all happen.
It is a lot of computer work. It's a very complex system. The man that developed the National Kidney Registry is actually a computer whiz. So I'm not surprised that he was able to figure out something like that. And he worked on it, of course, with a team of people, but it's wonderful, a wonderful addition to the, the donation community.
Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
I've been wondering about, what, if any, risks there are to being a living donor, say, of a kidney.
Mm-hmm.
Have there been any instances where live donors have subsequently had problems with the kidney that remained, or had problems with the surgery and the surgery was fatal?
So I don't know of any situations where the surgery failed, but I happen to sit on Living Donation Committee for the Organ Procurement Transplantation Network. And I can tell you that in the last 20 years, there were 250 living kidney donors who did need either a kidney or a liver later on in life. And what the Organ Procurement Transplantation Network has set up is that if that happens, they get top priority. So they go right to the top of the list because they were already a living donor. So I don't know the number of living kidney donations that have occurred in all the years, but 250, I think it was, when I looked at the data, it was 0.00003% of all the living kidney donations that had occurred. So it really is rare it can happen, but I think we've put some safeguards in place. And people go through such an intense physical that it would have to be something that would happen later that would cause their kidney to fail, that wouldn't have been caught in the physical that they had before they became a living donor. And the same goes for a living liver donor as well. They also can qualify for a kidney or a liver and go to the top of the list.
Thank you.
Mhm. But like any surgery, there are risks, and you are told about that. The average recovery for someone who has been a living kidney donor is 2 to 3 days in the hospital, and then possibly 2 weeks after that, where there are some lifting restrictions.
Back to you, Bob.
What are the most common diagnoses that a potential donor would have that would disqualify them from being a donor?
Hypertension, high blood pressure. Actually, my sister had 3 people that were tested to see if they could be a donor to her. And at the very last minute, one person was disqualified because they thought that she had a tendency to be hypertensive. And so they did not want to endanger her health by having her. She was a perfect match for my sister. And my sister just got lucky that there was somebody else that was able to be a donor to her. So that is the most common thing that disqualifies for somebody, because you can have high blood pressure and not know it. And so it's when people go through the physical that they find out that they have either their blood pressure is creeping up, or they do have high blood pressure and need to be treated.
What about diabetes?
So there is some consideration that type 2 diabetics under certain circumstances might be able to be a living kidney donor, but that still has not been determined yet. So it hasn't been something that has been adopted by the transplant community yet. Someone who is a type 1 diabetic is not able to be a kidney donor.
There are other questions? Yes, Deb, go ahead.
Looks like I was muted. I had a sister who was born with a congenital heart defect, and in the early 90s, we learned that she was going to need a heart-lung transplant eventually. She lived in New York, but I was living here, and I called the UW transplant unit and asked to speak to the social worker just to get some information about heart-lung transplants.
Mm-hmm.
And she was extremely helpful, and I remember her saying that it's very difficult to find. She said the heart isn't so difficult, but the lungs, because the lungs are such a big and fragile organ that it's rare to find a healthy set of lungs in a deceased donor. She also mentioned that there was an extensive battery of psychological tests that the recipient has to go through. So I can tell you're nodding that the lungs are pretty rare to find. Is in other types of donations, or do recipients have to go through that battery of psychological testing?
I did not personally, as a kidney recipient, have to go through that. I think part of the reason is that the recovery for a combination transplant recipient, especially heart lung or heart liver or heart kidney, all of those are done at UW. They are very complex. They involve 2 to 3 different teams working on the same patient. The recovery has to be done very, very quickly. So you only have less than 3 hours between recovery and transportation time. So for example, a donor in Green Bay would be able to donate to a waiting recipient here in Madison, because we could get them to the hospital by private, probably charter plane was how we would do it. But it's because of the recovery, the length of PT that's needed, the drugs and medications that are needed to manage 2 different types of organs that have been transplanted into the recipient, and how well their support network is. So I would say it's the combination organs that require more of a psychosocial evaluation than, say, a kidney or a liver.
Just just to follow up, my sister never reached that point. She died suddenly in 1993, but
Oh,
I've sort of been curious about that.
yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. And, you know, I have to say that there's been just a ton of progress made in combination organ transplants in the last 5 to 6 years. And here at UW, we've actually added some cardiac and thoracic surgeons manage lung patients who are excellent at what they do. And yesterday, in fact, I was with a young man who received a heart liver transplant 2 years ago. And, you know, he said he would do it all over again, even though he's still recovering and still only able to work 20 hours a week. He still would do it all over again.
Jim, yeah, you're muted. Jim, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? I'm not able to unmute you.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. My question is this: I've had some heart disease issues, and I'm on a routine of medicine for those heart-related issues. Is there any disqualification by the nature of medicines that we've had to take to stabilize our own bodies?
Boy, you know, I'm not an expert. I'm not clinical, so I can't really advise. That was something, you know, if you were interested, you could certainly contact the transplant center and see if you could get referred by your physician. I mean, we do heart transplants on people who have been living on a, you know, left ventricular assisted device for 2 years. We've done heart transplants on people who have been in the hospital for 3 to 4 months and haven't been able to leave. So they're on a lot of medications. So I can't really advise clinically how that impacts it. I know that's taken into consideration, but if it's something you want to explore, I would suggest talking to the cardiac team at the transplant center.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Um,
Yeah, Beth, go ahead.
I just am asking more generally. I understood that, except for one specific, I understood that Steve Coons was a rare person because he was healthy in other ways. Did he get a kidney? I don't know. And Javier got a kidney. But I thought because of a complex of conditions, most kidney transplants don't live as long as Steve Coons did. And I don't know what Javier's scenario is. And I have a friend whose son is just almost 30, so young. So I'm curious, and he's just doing dialysis. So I'm just curious what you know generally about what are conditions that would make you live longer with a kidney.
It's hard to say.
Let me provide a little bit of context too as well. Steve Coons was a beloved member of this community who died recently in the past few years, unfortunately. And he was young. He was, I don't know exactly how young, but he was in his 50s maybe. And the young man that Beth was talking about, actually his name is Jorge, and he first came to Madison from Guatemala to receive a kidney transplant when he was young, and now he's in his 20s and is in Guatemala, and we still send him medication to help him, and he's a friend of ours down in Guatemala. So that's a little bit of context on who Beth was talking about.
But
So it's very.
Steve lived a number of years that was a little, I thought, unusual for a kidney recipient. And it's because maybe he didn't have multiple organ issues. He just had a kidney issue or something.
I can't speak to the specifics of Steve, but but maybe Carol, if you'd like to speak more generally about life expectancy of recipients.
Yeah, and so someone who receives a kidney from a deceased donor, the average life value on that deceased donation is 7 years. And part of the reason is the immunosuppressant drugs that we take to prevent rejection can be very hard on our kidney and our liver. Now, I'm very fortunate. I'm 10 years out. Yesterday, I was at this event with the cyclist taking off to Louisiana, and one of my volunteers is 39 years out from his kidney donation. So you just never know. Every day that I get up, I give, thanks that the Lord has blessed me with this to see another day. And it's very difficult to predict how long a graft will last. The other issue that takes place is that there are some kidney diseases for which people receive a transplant, and that disease attacks the new kidney. I have a volunteer whose son has received 4 kidney transplants from living donors, and he's 45 years old. In my situation, the disease that I have does not attack the new transplanted kidney. So that can also impact it. So it can be a variety of reasons. It can be the type of genetic disease that you have could attack the new organ. It could be that your lifestyle is one that maybe you don't take your drugs when you're supposed to. Maybe you don't eat healthy as you're supposed to, and those sorts of things. Or it can just be the fact that, for some reason that kidney transplant did not last as long as the average. So it's hard to say.
Thank you. Yeah, Polly, we have time for, I think, probably one more question. So I'm glad that you got one.
Well, this really isn't a question. I just want to tell you, not only do I love medicine, but I picked up a book by Dr. Joshua Mesrich. Is it Mesrich, Carol?
Mesrich.
I knew I'd say it wrong. Anyway, he wrote this book, I don't know, in 2019. It's called When Death Becomes Life, Notes from a Transplant Surgeon. And I think he does primarily kidney. Is that right, Carol?
He does do primarily kidney. He also is one of our surgeons that recovers kidneys from a lot of living donors. He is a fantastic person, very funny. And his brother is also a writer. And the book can be a little intense at times because he does go into quite a bit of clinical knowledge, but it's fascinating. I've read it myself. So I recommend it if you're interested.
Yeah, and he explains a little bit of the history, but you're right, Carol. I mean, he's quippy, but he also tells it like it is. And I was just fascinated. That's why I had to hunt you down, Carol.
Well, I thank you for doing that, Polly. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. You've been so informative. And I hope some of us, decide to be organ donors at some time.
Somebody just mentioned in the chat that, yes, he's done a few, Dr. Mesrich has done some interviews, and there's one on NPR that's very good as well for Fresh Air. So.
Oh, okay. When do you think he did that?
I think it was last year or the year before. I think it might have been 2019, actually.
So if I Google Fresh Air, I could find him?
You could.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I considered running over to the hospital to get him to sign this, but then I thought that would be too creepy. So.
Well, we have that recorded, so thank you, Polly. Thank you so much for being here, Carol, for sharing with us and for helping us learn about how we can give life and help others to serve God, serve neighbor, and do our part. Before we go, I'd like to say a quick prayer. Mm-hmm. Wonderful God, you give us all things. You've created us good, and you've invited us to be stewards of creation. Help us to be stewards of one another by giving of ourselves. You are a healer. When you came to this place, you healed the sick May we emulate you in doing the same. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.